Back in GameMaker, if you go to a new project and you scroll down here to the Windy Woods, you can create this new game, and I'm going to call this my last name, Windy Woods, and I'll go ahead and create it. After it opens, go ahead and play the game. You can see our character has an idle animation, and if we use our left and right arrows, then they move around, and when we stop, they go back to the idle. So we're going to replace this idle animation. Back in GameMaker, we're going to go down to sprites. So this is a fairly complex game. There's a lot happening, but we really are just focusing on replacing the graphic assets of the sprites. So if we go down to the player folder within sprites, we can see that there's a sprite player idle. If we open this up and then go to edit image, we can see that there's a sprite animation that's quite long. This is working at 15 frames a second. So what we're going to do is replace this. Now, in some of the animations, there's actually little flags on them that basically speak to the code at that particular point in the animation. But with the idle, we don't need to worry about that. So we don't need to make an animation that's this long, but we are going to replace the sprite. Use the software and hardware of your choice to create a 3 to 10 frame long animation for your idle. Here's my 3-frame idle animation of a gnome playing a guitar. If you don't have a lot of time and you just need to get some assets in the game so you can fine-tune them later, you can always use the puppet warp in Photoshop to distort a character to give it an idle animation. So this is the very first frame of my animation, and this is just the neutral pose. And so what I need is a squashed pose and then also a stretched pose. And I'll adjust the timing of these directly in GameMaker. So for the second one, my squash pose, I've already done this one, so I can sort of compare and contrast those two. So for frame 3, which is this one, I want to have a stretched animation. I'll go to File, Puppet Warp, and first what I'm going to do is set a series of pins on the bottom of his feet, because I don't want his feet to move around while I'm doing these distortions. In fact, you can see there's a little bit of a wobble there, so I'm going to undo that and reset those pins. And I just want the feet to try to stay planted on the ground as much as possible. Then I'm going to go ahead and put one at the hip bones to try and stretch him up, and 2 at his knees to sort of move his knees inwards. So I'm going to actually break the joint. So I'm going to move this up, and you can see the top of his hat is cropping off the top of the sprite sheet. I'm going to fix this in a moment, but first I'm going to get the exaggeration in. So I'm going to go ahead and bow his legs in a little bit, and then stretch this up a little bit, stretch his arms in, remembering to keep the volume the same. And then to have some overlapping action, I'm actually going to have the secondary animations of his mustache and his hat bend down, because as secondary animations, as the main part of his body goes up, the secondary things would be taking a second to catch up. So to make it sort of look like that, I'm going to have the mustache edges kind of bend out and down a little bit. Not too much. This might actually be almost too much. And then I'm going to have his hat bend down a little bit. And once I kind of have that movement how I want, I can hit return, and I can sort of go through and compare how that looks. Now, I set this file up pretty big because I want to have a high resolution in case I ever need those pixels back. So I'm going to go to File and Save. Actually, I haven't saved this yet. So I'll call this Gnome Idle, and I'm going to call it 500 pixels because that's how big this is. And then next, I'm going to go ahead and save a copy of this at the size that I want, which if I check the design document is 154 by 154 pixels. So back in Photoshop, I'll go ahead and go to Image, Image Size. I realize you can't see this, so Image Size, and then 154 pixels. But I'll go ahead and do Save As, and I'll save this as 154. And then I can export this. So I'll go ahead and export layers to files, and I'm going to call this sprite idle 154, and I'll put the G back in just so I don't get confused. I'm going to make sure this is saving in that same folder, and I'll say run. And now I'm ready to bring those into Texture Packer. Once I open up Texture Packer, I'm going to choose the free version. And once it opens up, I'll say, no, I just want to create sprite sheets. And then I can drag in those three idle animations into here. And there it lays them out. I'm going to also set where I want this to be. So I'll click on the folder icon here, and I just want to make sure it's going into that folder. So I'm going to save this as sprite G idle sheet. And that way I'll know that this is my sprite sheet. And then I'll say publish sprite sheet. Now I'm ready to go back into GameMaker. Back in GameMaker, we'll go back down to our player and open up your sprite player idle if it's not open already. And then we're going to go ahead and just import an image. So go to import, and we'll go to that folder we created and find our sprite sheet. And then we'll say open. It's going to ask us if we want to continue, and we say yes. So there's our image. Now we need to go back in and edit that image. So here it's again coming in as all three images in one sprite. So after you go into edit image, at the very top you'll see a new menu option, which I realize you can't see right now, but at the very top there's a new menu option called image. If we go to image, there's convert to frames. So we're going to convert this to frames, and then we're going to tell it how many frames we want. We want it to be 3 frames wide and 3 frames per the row. We also want this to be 154 by 154. It's important that our new sprite matches the existing sprite if we want to replace them like this. Otherwise, we actually break the game code if it's too small. Once you set those changes, then you can go ahead and click convert and say yes. And there's our new sprite. And we can play this and we can see that it's quite fast. So what I want to do is I want to actually add a frame in between the neutral and the stretch version. So this is the original, this is the squash, this is the stretch. So I'm going to go ahead and control click on this and say duplicate frames, and then just slide it in between. So it goes from stretch to normal to squash to normal and then back to stretch. So now if I play this, it's a little bit smoother. And what I can do is I can play around with the timing of these too. So if I want to hold this neutral one for a little bit longer, I could control click on that and duplicate it. And I can do the same thing with this one. So when you duplicate a frame, it'll just add it right after the current frame. So now it's a little bit slower. And this is a good time anytime you import a new sprite to test it to make sure that it didn't accidentally break some of the mechanics that are happening in the game. Again, if this isn't exactly 154 by 154 pixels, it does actually mess with the directional controls for the player. So let's go ahead and test this again. Okay, and there's our idle animation. I'd probably go back in and add some more frames to smooth that out, especially that little mustache twirl. The mustache twirl is really cute, but it's going to need a lot more frames to make that work. But the really important thing is I need to test this. So if I use my left and right directional buttons, I can see it goes back to the original sprite, and then it goes back to my gnome. So this is working just fine. I would just have to go back in and then create new animations for the rest of those actions.